Okay, at number one, Miami. We had them at number one last week. They are going through a much-deserved bye week, but last week's performance against Florida did very little to adjust what I think the Hurricanes can do. Man, they can beat you running it. They can beat you throwing it. They can beat you with their defensive line. They can beat you with their secondary. That was a dominant performance from start to finish against the Florida Gators. And I think if you look at the score, I know it was at one point, 13-7 there for a little bit. I think Florida really only manufactured one offensive drive that was of significant threat against Miami. That was a clinic last week in execution on the defensive side. Their third down performance in and of itself was off the charts good. At number two, it's the Ohio State Buckeyes. We had them at number two last week. They had a bye last week. They remain unchanged, still super bullish on what we've seen from the Buckeyes up to this point. But I will admit, I think this week's game might be their toughest test to date. Has nothing to do with the disrespect of Texas in that situation. We know the Buckeyes beat the Longhorns. I like Texas. I think Texas is a good football team. But going on the road, playing against a team that no one's really been talking about, but I've been keeping close tabs on, going to Washington, this will produce a significant challenge. And I think Ohio State will live up to it, but this will be a game in which you're going to learn quite a bit about what this Ohio State team might be able to do long term. We will see. It's going to be a fantastic one. We'll break it down on tomorrow's show. At number three, it's the Oregon Ducks. Handled business again. They dominate their in-state rival. That in-state rival, however, though, is 0-4. So it was not of significant surprise. They were number three for us last week. That's unchanged. They go to Penn State this weekend. We'll find out all we need to know about both Oregon and the Nittany Lions here in, 4 days or so. LSU is at number four. They are up one spot from where they were a week ago. They actually, and I know, should we be drawing conclusions about Southeast Louisiana? No. Should LSU actually maybe be a little bit penalized from what happened to Florida, who is one of their wins? Should they be penalized for what's now happened to Clemson, who's one of their wins? Yeah, probably. I think you can make a good case for that. However, I'm going to keep them at four. I think that defense is that good. And I did see signs of life from LSU's offense last week, albeit against lesser competition. I'm good with them at four right now because they're going on the road to Ole Miss. We'll see what happens this weekend. That Ole Miss team is legit. They can move the football. They could score. And I do think LSU's offense does have a chance to manufacture some points of their own against an Ole Miss defense that has at times struggled here these last few weeks. At number five, it's the Georgia Bulldogs. They were number four last week. I just flip-flopped the two. Georgia didn't play. Why is LSU in front of Georgia based off a game on Southeast Louisiana? I'm not really sure. All I can tell you is that I did see progress made from LSU last week. I had them three a couple weeks ago, so I'm just putting them back where I had them a little while ago. It's not a referendum on anything Georgia's done up to this point. They'll get Bama this weekend. That will be kind of a put up or shut up game for those two teams. We look forward to watching it on Saturday night. Florida State is at number six. They were number seven last week. They're at Virginia on Friday night. This will be a tricky game. I like what I've seen so far from Virginia's offense. I really believe that. I think there's a lot of opportunities for Virginia to be a bit of a spoiler in the ACC this year when the middle of the ACC is kind of wide open. UVA is one of those teams that can score, but I've been very bullish on Florida State all throughout the season. I continue to be there in my top six this week. At number seven, it's Oklahoma. I had them at number six last week. They beat a ranked team and they slide down one spot. This isn't necessarily a hindrance on Oklahoma. I just maybe am adjusting a little bit. Their win against Michigan strengthened after Michigan went and took care of business against a Nebraska team on the road. That was a good win for the Wolverines. More on them in just a minute. But in watching Oklahoma up close, there were a couple things that had me just the tiniest bit concerned. I didn't love how their offensive line played. I thought there were times on the outside in which their wide receivers were blanketed in coverage. I thought John Mateer was solid and he battled and he ended up making the plays necessary to win the game. But I might have had them a little bit too high than they probably should have been at this point. I think seven's appropriate. So just kind of readjusted a bit. Have been slightly more impressed with Florida State, who I had jump right in front of them after this weekend's matchups. At number eight, big move for this team based on last week, it is the Texas Tech Red Raiders. They were 25 last week in our top 25 to go on the road into a hostile environment, play against a high-quality Utah football team that is remarkably physical. I saw all I needed to see from Texas Tech to go toe-to-toe against a team that I had a tremendous amount of respect for, and to beat them at their own game is not something I'm used to seeing. So I believe that all the reinforcements that Texas Tech brought in to solidify their roster, man, it's been impressive now. And it just needed to see it. They hadn't played anybody in the first 3 weeks, so kind of had to see it. Now we have them into the top 10, all the way into the top 8. They get a bye this week after smoking Utah a week ago. At number 9, it's the Indiana Hoosiers. Last week, they were unranked for us, partly because they hadn't really played anybody. They go and make mincemeat of an Illinois team that I'm not quite as high on. The reason why Texas Tech is in front of Indiana at this point is that I like Utah a lot more than I like Illinois. That's why. So I really like, so far, what I've seen from both those teams. They're both in the top 10. However, I do think Texas Tech's best win is against a better team than Indiana's best win at this point. But Indiana can further solidify their ranking with a win on the road at Iowa this week. Penn State drops to 10 from number 8. It's not anything that Penn State did. Penn State just needed to drop down a little bit to allow for both Indiana and Texas Tech to slide into the top 10 after last week's one-sided results. They'll get Oregon this week. They get a win this week at home. We'll break that game down in its entirety on tomorrow's show. They get a win at home. I think Penn State will probably vault all the way into the top 3. So they're in a great spot. They're fine. They have slipped based on our preseason expectations, but it's partly because I don't feel like we've seen their best football just yet. At number 11, it's A&M. They were number 9 last week. Nothing to do with A&M's performance in the bye week. We know that, but we had to accommodate a couple teams that had great performances. They'll host Auburn this week. That should be another good opportunity for A&M to further solidify their spot as a contender in the SEC. At number 12, we have the Ole Miss Rebels. They were number 13 a week ago. We slid them up one spot. Thought they looked fantastic in the win against Tulane, and Tulane is a team that I have a lot of respect for. Trinidad Chambliss continues to be remarkable with what we've seen. They'll host LSU this week, so they can only strengthen their resume in victory this weekend. At number 13 is the Texas Longhorns. They were number 11 last week, and while the offense showed some signs of life, I've just seen more from the teams that currently sit right in front of Texas. They're on a bye week this week. Then they'll go to Florida before they face off against Oklahoma in what might be a top 10 clash. At number 14, it's Tennessee. They were number 15 last week. They move up one spot. They're in a good spot, but I do think this week's game's a little dangerous. Going on the road to Mississippi State, need to be careful. I think Mississippi State is a team that has impressed me a lot with their improvements from last year to this year. How real are they? We'll find out against a Tennessee team that I have a tremendous amount of respect for. At number 15, I have Alabama. They were number 16 last week. On the bye week, they move up one spot. A couple teams in front of them fell out. They'll go to Georgia this week. A win against Georgia will vault Alabama well into the top 10 because that will be a very difficult and hostile environment for the Crimson Tide to try to navigate through. At number 16, it's USC. They were number 18 for us last week. We move up a couple spots. I love what I've seen from the run game. I love what I've seen so far from Jaden Mayava. I do think defensively there's a couple things to clean up on the back end, but that team is as dangerous as any in the entire Big Ten. I think they can score with anybody, and if they can shore up some of their challenges on broken plays and creating explosives against them, they'll be in a great spot. They'll go on the road to Illinois. That'll be a 9 o'clock local kick for USC. Will they be up and at 'em and ready to roll there in Champaign? We will find out. At 17, it's Vanderbilt. They were 17 last week. They'll get Utah State at home this week. At 18, it's Georgia Tech. They're up from 19 last week. They'll go on the road to Wake Forest. At 19, it's Michigan. They were 23 last week. I have now moved them up 4 spots after what I think was a very impressive win against the Nebraska Cornhuskers, a win that Nebraska kind of felt like they had to have. Michigan said, nah, we're going to take care of our business. They did impressively, I might add. They're now up into the top 20. Missouri is at number 20. They were 20 last week. They get UMass at home. Iowa State, we had them at 21 last week. They remain at 21. They'll get Arizona at home this week. That's a dangerous game there for Iowa State. I like what I've seen so far in the progress made from Arizona in year 2 under Brent Brennan. At number 22, it's the Auburn Tigers. They were 14 last week. I've now dropped them to 22. They're at Notre Dame this week. Pretty significant drop for an Auburn team that I think actually impressed quite a few people, including me, with their performance on the road at Oklahoma. But the Baylor loss to Arizona State hurts them just a little bit. They couldn't really get a whole lot going offensively, it felt like, in that matchup against Oklahoma. So I've just slid them down, maybe an overcorrection. Might have had them a little too high at 14 last week. So slid them down to a little bit more appropriate number 22. They'll go on the road to A&M this week, though, and with a win, A&M right now is a team that I have a tremendous amount of respect for. That can do a lot for Auburn in getting back into the top 20, maybe even the top 15, depending on how things look in that matchup. At number 23, it's the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. They were number 22 last week. I slid them down one spot. I continue to be concerned with what they have on the defensive side. Now you have a couple guys that are banged up, maybe not at 100%. That's something worth monitoring before they go on the road to Arkansas, a team who's licking their wounds as well after gift wrapping a game to Memphis by fumbling the ball inside the 5. That's a game that Notre Dame better be prepared for because Arkansas can score. Super dynamic quarterback. Notre Dame might have their hands full this weekend against the Hogs. At number 24, it's TCU. They were unranked last week. They'll go to Arizona State. That game will be on Friday night. And then finally, at number 25, it's BYU. I had them unranked this week. They're at Colorado. 3 teams that dropped out of my rankings last week. Utah. They were in the top 10 last week. They've now dropped all the way out because what bothered me most about what I saw from Utah is the fact that when there's a team that beats them up physically, they give up a bunch of yards on the ground, they have 4 turnovers. It was a very uncharacteristic Utah performance. That's hard for me to unsee. Now, they're in full control of their own destiny. Things hopefully will lighten up for them moving forward. They still have a lot of tough games at home, but that home field did not have any impact whatsoever on the Texas Tech Red Raiders. Utah's got to get back to business and be more efficient on both sides of the ball moving forward. At number 12, it was Illinois last week. They drop all the way out. I have not been impressed with Illinois this year. I do feel like the win against Duke was an impressive one with how they finished in the second half, but they kind of fall out, man. I just don't know. There's something up there. And I'll be curious. If they can bounce back in a big way this week against SC and get a win, they'll get back in the top 25. I can't unsee that drubbing that they took last week against Indiana. And then at 24, Mississippi State dropped out just to accommodate a couple impressive performances from Big 12 teams.